It's not morally right to keep borrowing at these levels. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, has shared his thoughts on the wealth tax proposals in a new interview out today in The Spectator. So we're going to take a look at what this interview tells us about future plans for taxation, borrowing, dealing with the UK economy post-Brexit, and also what Sunak thinks about these wealth tax proposals to tax the rich on their pensions, properties, investments and cash savings at 5%. And spoiler alert, I won't make you wait to the end of the video, but he has not read their report yet. I'm Martin Bamford, a chartered financial planner at Informed Choice, and I make videos about personal finance, investing and happiness. If that sounds like a potent mix for you to learn more about, please click on that little red subscribe button to join our subscriber community here on YouTube. I'd love to have you on board. It's completely free and you will never miss another video. So come on, press that subscribe button now. So I'm going to take a look at some of the highlights from this interview in The Spectator that Rishi Sunak has done. It's been published today. It's already generating quite a lot of headlines and it is a wide-ranging interview. It looks at public borrowing, it looks at taxation, it looks at the post-Brexit economy. So we're going to look at some of the highlights, what that means for the economy, what it means for the taxes we pay, and also some lessons we can draw from his attitudes for our own personal finances. So this interview in The Spectator comes 10 months after Rishi Sunak landed in this role of Chancellor, and what a 10 months. Can you imagine going into that number 11 office back in February and then thinking, my goodness, I've got about 3.5 weeks to prepare a budget, not knowing what was just around the corner in terms of the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. And Sunak talks about that. He says, I thought the most difficult professional thing would be to put a budget together in 3.5 weeks, but it turned out actually that was probably the easiest thing we've had to do. And of course, since becoming Chancellor back in February, Sunak has had to support the economy. He's had to support businesses through things like the furlough scheme, through the business interruption loan schemes, all sorts of things. And he's seen public borrowing absolutely surge to reach its highest peacetime levels in the UK. Not a comfortable position for any Chancellor to be in, but particularly for a Conservative Chancellor where borrowing such huge amounts of money does not come naturally. And in fact, the interview draws comparisons with the role of Gordon Brown as Chancellor, because in the past 9 months, Rishi Sunak has borrowed more money than Gordon Brown did in his entire role, his entire time as Chancellor. So from a comparison point of view, that's quite a shocking set of stats, but we're going through incredible times, unprecedented times right now. Sunak says that this outrageous level of public borrowing has to come to an end. He says in the interview, it is clearly not sustainable to borrow at these levels. I don't think morally, economically or politically it would be right. He says running a structural deficit years into the future with debt rising, that's not building up the resilience you need to deal with the future shock that will come along, and someone else will be sitting in my chair. We now have had 2 of these things in a decade. Who knows what the next shock will be? And I think that's a really good lesson for our personal finances too. We have this saying in the world of personal financial planning, which is you fix your roof when the sun is shining. You don't wait until it starts raining before you start patching up the holes. And it's exactly the same. Now, arguably, the sun is not shining from an economic perspective right now. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic, and we have lots of economic restrictions in place here in the UK, and we have this no-deal Brexit looming at the start of next year, less than a month away as well. So there are still economic rainy days with us right now. But it's quite right, as Chancellor, that Rishi Sunak thinks about fixing the roof. He thinks about dealing with this public debt issue, this structural issue, before the next challenge comes along, the next crisis, because these crises are inevitable. They come along at fairly regular intervals. In fact, in the last decade, seem to have been happening more frequently than they maybe have historically. So it's quite right that he wants to address these public finance issues as soon as he can, as soon as he's able to. But of course, right now, Rishi Sunak has something playing in his favour, and that is the incredibly low cost of government borrowing. It's costing the government approximately 0.3% at the moment to pay debt. So the interest charge they're paying on public borrowing, 0.3%. But he is conscious that that borrowing cost could go up. And in fact, it nearly did earlier this year, but the Bank of England started printing some more money, kept the cost of borrowing down as low as possible. He said, are you or anyone else going to guarantee me that for the duration of this parliament, rates might not go back to 1%. So that's a fear, clearly, that Rishi Sunak has, which is the cost of borrowing could treble in the lifetime of this parliament, so in the fairly short term over the next 4 or 5 years. And that is incredibly problematic for the Chancellor, because a trebling cost of borrowing could really unseat and unhinge the state of the public finances. And another personal finance lesson, I think, that comes from that particular statement, which is our own personal cost of borrowing. Look, interest rates have been so low for so long that I think it's easy for us to become complacent and think they're going to remain low forever. And of course, that isn't necessarily the case. As Chancellor Rishi Sunak says, you can't guarantee us that rates will stay low forever. So think about your own cost of borrowing. Personally, I'm on a bank rate tracker mortgage. I have a very, very low mortgage cost at the moment, but I know that's not going to last forever. I'm very careful not to fall into that complacency trap, and I suggest that everyone thinks in the same way too. What happens when interest rates go up to 1%, 2%, 3%, as could well happen in the future, particularly if inflation starts to surge and the Bank of England needs to use interest rates as one of their levers, one of their mechanisms for bringing price inflation back under control. And Sunak explains that one of the reasons interest rates are staying so low, the cost of government borrowing stays so low, is because of the Bank of England's programme of quantitative easing. They're printing money to buy up bonds. He says there is this very large QE thing that's going on. No one has done that before. There are plenty of smart investors who are also thinking about the risks of inflation over the next 12 months because we are now so levered. Small changes can have huge cash implications. If I have to come up with 10 to 20 billion pounds a year in a few years' time because things have changed, well, that's a lot of money. So a warning there that inflation is a risk on Chancellor Rishi Sunak's mind. I've made a video recently about the risk of rising price inflation in 2021 that's worth a watch as well. But some things to think about. And as I said a moment ago, if inflation starts to surge, the Bank of England does have interest rates as a lever they can pull as a mechanism to bring it back under control. Now, of course, there is a political aspect at play here as well. Sunak is, after all, a Tory Chancellor. He says if we, the Tories, think borrowing is the answer to everything, that debt rising is fine, then there's not much difference between us and the Labour Party. I worry about what that means for us politically down the line. So he's thinking about what's the economic point of difference between a Conservative government and any future Labour government. What's the electorate have to choose from? It is not comfortable, as I mentioned, for a Tory Chancellor to be borrowing such huge amounts of money. This is so out of his comfort zone, it's unbelievable, but needs must. He's gone through an extraordinary 10 months and he's had to do this. Later in the interview, Sunak explains that he wants to see a quick bounce back in the state of the UK economy, and part of that bounce back will be driven by the vaccination programme. Now, some very interesting comments in this interview in The Spectator about the vaccination programme, because since that vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, was approved by UK regulators, I think the government message has been very cautious, very pessimistic. It hasn't really hinted at a quick release and a quick return to normal. And I think within this interview, for the first time, we're hearing a bit more optimism. So Sunak says that he's had advice from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, that's Jonathan Van Tam, or JVT as Boris Johnson loves to call him, and it said it might not be long before we can vaccinate the people whose demographic group accounts for 99% of deaths. And he says once you've done that, that gives you flexibility and options, because at the point you're dealing with something that doesn't have the same impact on people's health or the same impact on the healthcare system. So this best case scenario from Rishi Sunak appears to be you vaccinate the most vulnerable in society first, which is what they've already started doing. We're seeing this at hospitals and at vaccination centres around England now. And you vaccinate that group who account for, say, 99% of the death rate, and all of a sudden the impact of releasing society, letting things open back up, letting businesses get back to normal is not as severe, it's not as significant as it would have otherwise been. Yes, the virus will still be in circulation, yes, infection rates will rise, but it won't necessarily lead to hospitalisations, people in intensive care units, and then deaths of the most vulnerable. So very interesting views from the Chancellor there based on the feedback he's had from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And then we can't go through this interview, of course, without touching on those wealth tax proposals from last week. The Wealth Tax Commission really throwing a bit of a hand grenade in the pile to say, what about we tax the rich 5% of the value of their property, pensions, investments, savings, business assets, etc. And it was not particularly welcomed, I'd say, by most people in society when those were proposed, and we were waiting to hear what Chancellor Rishi Sunak had to make of this. At the time those proposals were made, I explained that politically that would be a very uncomfortable proposal for a Tory Chancellor, because it does not fit with the Conservative view of the world when it comes to how you tax people and fairness in terms of taxing the wealth creators. And he confirmed that in the interview. Sunak said, "I think that's right in a sense that we're the party that believes in aspiration. Actually, we should be celebrating aspiration." So taxing the wealth creators has that unintended consequence, potentially, of deterring wealth creation, deterring aspiration. That's not something the Conservative government would be interested in doing. However, he does admit in the interview he's not had time to read the report yet, but I wouldn't read too much into that comment. Of course, he doesn't sit there and read every report that comes across his desk, but he has advisors. He'll be aware of the broad proposals, and I don't think the fact he's not read the report in full can tell us that he's likely to consider it or likely to accept it in the future. I would draw a line under those wealth tax proposals by virtue of Chancellor Rishi Sunak's comments in this interview. And the interview concludes with a quick comment on Brexit, with Sunak saying that he would like to see free ports introduced in the UK and that he'll be naming some of those in the spring budget. And he'd also like to see the UK doing more trade deals. In the interview, he talks about supporting the economy if a trade deal fails to materialise, as currently seems to be the case. We're really up against it in terms of the clock ticking and that end-of-year deadline for the transition period. So he's saying that one option is that existing COVID support measures for businesses could effectively be remodelled, extended to cover any short-term economic impact of a no-trade deal Brexit. So you could see the extension of furlough schemes, the extension of guaranteed loan schemes, that sort of thing as well. Sunak says, "For businesses that need liquidity to get through a temporary time, we've got very generous government guarantee loan programs for anyone who is having trouble with costs and employment. You can furlough your staff all the way to the spring. So those are pretty significant things." So potentially there is more government support to come if the economic shock from a no-deal Brexit is significant. What did you make of the comments from Rishi Sunak in this particular interview? Do you think we can draw a line under the wealth tax proposals now? Let me know in the comments down below. I read every single comment and I do my best to respond to every single comment too. So please do leave a comment. I love to read them. I love to respond to them. I love to hear what you're thinking. Thank you so much for watching this video. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.